What's up everybody, Alex here. Welcome back to another video. Today's video is going to be what I'm calling a power pop primer, alliteration, through the decades. Power pop is one of my favorite genres, and I think I put it out there because for folks who know me, probably associate me more with like prog and metal and jazz and self-indulgent sort of stuff, and power pop is the complete antithesis of that. So I love the genre, and I wanted to do sort of a deep dive, and the way I kind of thought about this was, what if we looked at power pop through the decades? How did it change? Where did it start? Where is it now? And so forth and so on. So let's dive in, huh? Let me preface it with this. I'm not an expert at all. There are experts out there. Go support them. Go love them. I'm not an expert. I just love it. And I'm going to be showing records today that I own. And if I don't show it, chances are I don't own it. But for me, I kind of wanted to, again, go through power pop as we know it, starting in the 60s and going all the way to today, which is 2024. So this might be a little bit all over the place, but I'm going to be showing a bunch of records. And I hope you like it. So first and foremost, power pop was allegedly a term that was created or coined by Pete Townshend from The Who in 1967 to sort of explain their style. And who better than Pete Townshend to define or coin any of these terms? But what's really important, I think, about thinking about power pop is, where did it start? When did it start? Well, theoretically, you could sure go back to the 50s and rock and roll. And, you know, really all power pop kind of is this idea of the power of, you know, rock and roll, maybe some power chords or whatever it is. And then the pop sensibility, right? So are there pop bands? Absolutely. Were there pop bands in the 60s that didn't have the power aspect? Yes. Were maybe there bands that had the power but didn't have the pop? Sure. And so really this was that sort of melding of the power, the chords, the rhythms, all that kind of stuff mixed in with these vocal melodies. We mixed in with these great pop sensibilities, these great 2, 3, 4 minute songs that didn't have that self-indulgence that was kind of going on. And so, of course, much like anything else, the Beatles were the first, right? So, I mean, going all the way back to 63. Yeah, I mean, it's covers, but it's done in their way. And yes, like anything else, everything starts with the Beatles. But for me, and I show Please Please Me's obviously because that's where it began. But I started thinking, what's the record to me, the Beatles record, that represents power pop the most in terms of maybe its influence or what it would become? Because, you know, if you think about it, you know, Sgt. Pepper was really experimental type stuff. Obviously, Revolver, it's like their psych record. You know, Rubber Soul, kind of like their folky record, right? So to me, I'm thinking the Beatles' power pop record, for me, would be Help. You know, it's a good combination of, you know, obviously things like Ticket to Ride with the great melodies, but obviously some of the heavier type tunes like Help or whatever it might be too. So to me, the Beatles album that represents power pop the best was Help. Now, yeah, the Beatles were the first to do everything, but the British invasion really started this whole power pop thing. I would say all of those bands, with the exception of maybe the Stones, just because they came from such a bluesy background, but to me, really an artist that people don't talk about enough, but a shout out to my boy Sam St. John. I know he just saw these cats in concert the other night. But to me, a band that doesn't get talked about because they're lumped in with some later psychedelia. But this record for sure, She's Not There by the Zombies, represents power pop to me big time. This is an original mono on the Parrot label. You know, especially She's Not There, the title track, sort of again what it would become and what power pop would be known as. Of course, we can't really talk about the power aspect until we talk about the Kinks and their debut, or their U.S. debut, that You Really Got Me. I mean, you could argue that You Really Got Me was sort of that first power song, right? And obviously the big pop sensibilities too. What was the 64 or so? Yeah, I mean, the Kinks were huge at this with the Davis or the Davies brothers. You know, they really were probably that first band that really started chunking on those chords, had the distortion, as bad as it might have sounded to today's ears, whatever it is. But you could argue that more so than these other bands, the Kinks sort of were the first to really, really tone in and dial in on this tone. And for me, I'm going to jump up. This is where they got a little bit more, I think, experimental. But at the same time, to me, I'm going to something else because I think one of the best songs ever, this is from 1967, is Waterloo Sunset. To me, that is a perfect pop song. Yeah, it might not have the power aspect there, but other stuff on this record does, and what came before it with Face to Face and King Controversy and that other stuff. So yeah, to me, the Kinks, obviously, honestly, they could have defined it more than anybody. But of course, the coiner of the term was Pete Townsend from The Who. And yeah, this type of stuff, this is the US version. The Who sings My Generation. It was My Generation in the UK. This was 65, and this is a power pop record, 1000%. Of course, here though is maybe my favorite before they went full conceptual type stuff. And this was the bridge record, The Who Sell Out from 67. And that was the year that he was kind of defining or coining how they would describe their music. And so, yeah, Who Sell Out. Of course, this one's a little bit different because it's like concept record. It's got all these like fake infomercials going on in there. But in terms of the music itself, the sensibilities, power pop as it were, I think this is a great representation of that. So British Invasion, first check, and I think those 4 bands that I showed really represent it. So let's enter into the early 70s now. And of course, where the Beatles left off, another band comes in. And it's one of my favorite bands. And to me, this is a band that defines the genre, especially early. And in the UK, we're talking 1970, 1971 here or so. And I'm talking about Badfinger. And to me, these are the 2 records that really define it. No Dice and Straight Up. These are absolute classics to me. This is really their masterpiece, but I think this one's just up there just as much. Specifically, I got the 45 of No Matter What, which was a huge hit. But again, I mean, of course, when Badfinger was out, people thought they sounded too much like the Beatles. They were the first band signed to the Beatles label, Apple Records. But again, this idea of these are some great rock and roll songs, but the melodies and the songwriting are just so brilliant. The work of Pete Ham specifically was just absolutely amazing at this. And so to me, when you're talking early 70s power pop from the UK, this is ideal. This is where it's at for me. It's Badfinger. I love a lot of their records, but to me, if you're going to start somewhere, it's No Dice here, and it's Straight Up. Absolute, beautiful, perfect power pop records all the way around. And that's going on in the UK. So what's going on in the US? Well, a little bit different because their influences are a little bit different. You know, there's some proto-punk type stuff that may or may not have been starting at the time. Of course, in these times too, progressive rock is huge. Jazz fusion's growing a little bit more. And so to me, where it really starts in the US is with an artist who sort of became and still is kind of a musical chameleon. He just kind of does whatever he wants to. He released a couple records before this that were a little bit more, I guess maybe singer-songwriter based, if you want to call it that. But to me, the biggest sort of influence, here we're talking 1972 early, is Todd Rundgren and Something Anything. This was a record store day release from a couple of years ago, double 45. Absolutely incredible record. I know people, I think Todd is a pretty polarizing figure, but to me, in terms of power pop, especially I Saw the Light and some of the other hits on here were just so good. And yeah, I mean, to me, Todd was outstanding. After this, he'd go a little bit more experimental and then kind of dip his toes in and out. But 1000%, Todd Rundgren's Something Anything from 72 is a power pop staple and a power pop artist for me. Now, also going on in 72, and therefore, you know, onward, and you could argue that, especially at the time, this was the biggest U.S. power pop band. And of course, they're from the great city of Cleveland, Ohio, and that's the Raspberries. This was their first record, self-titled from 72. And this is actually, for those who don't know, was originally released as, this was a scratch and sniff sticker at the time. But you know what? Fresh, which came out shortly thereafter, terrible artwork aside, and then Three Sides, which came out after that. These are all absolutely amazing power pop records, but I would say there's a little bit more emphasis on the pop. It's a little bit schmaltzier. It's really an Eric Carmen fest. R.I.P. We just lost him a couple of weeks ago. But when you're talking early to mid 70s power pop from the U.S., that most defined sound to me is the Raspberries. And they had some huge hits, of course, with Go All the Way and some others. And so, yeah, definitely a huge Raspberries fan. Again, these 3 records are awesome, amazing power pop going on. Also, kind of during the time, I had to show this record. This is another Ohio band, a little bit lesser known. They're out of Youngstown, Ohio. This came out in 1973 and is a brilliant record that I would recommend for anybody if you can find it, although it's not easy to find. And that's Blue Ash's debut, No More, No Less. This is 73. I think this is on Polydor maybe, or Mercury, Polydor or Mercury. Again, out of Ohio, an amazing, amazing power pop record. If you're into, all the stuff that we're talking about and we'll be talking about, you will love this record. But again, not known as much, especially outside of Ohio. People in Ohio and across maybe the Midwest here know Blue Ash a lot. But to me, this is just outstanding power pop, hard rock and roll, amazing stuff. Here's an interesting one because this is a band that's gotten a lot of love recently. They've sort of had this, resurgence in a sense. Cheers. But at the time, they weren't popular. At the time, people didn't know who they were. They were going through a lot of struggles. They had all types of distribution issues with their label. And so there's sort of been a renaissance and love with this band. But again, at the time, they weren't as big as, some of these other bands that we're talking about. And I'm talking about Big Star, of course, #1 record that came out in 73, 72, 73. And then their follow-up, Radio City from 74. Both of these are amazing. This is the one that gets all the love, but this one's really great too. I will say this doesn't have Chris Bell on here, so if you're a Chris Bell fan, sorry about it. But yeah, it's interesting. Just a pretty heartbreaking story with this band. Again, everybody loves them now. These are classics, but at the time, yeah, they might have been critically successful. The critics loved them, but the distribution deals were so bad. They were coming out of Ardent Records, which was distributed by Stax, and it was just a mess out of Memphis. And so, yeah, it's an interesting thing because now these are mandatory power pop records. You need these. Originals go for hundreds and hundreds of dollars. That's why I got these really great craft reissues that you can always get for $25 or so. But this is mandatory power pop from the mid-70s. Big Star out of Memphis, just amazing stuff. But just a sad and interesting kind of story too. Here's a band that does not get talked about enough. They're out of Berkeley, California. And again, now we're kind of, moving through here into the into the later 70s. I think this one was 77, the first record came out. And then the follow-up was 79. And that's the Rubinoos. This is their debut here, and then their follow-up back to the drawing board. This is like, to me, this feels like Raspberries a few years later, and it really is. It's a little bit more schmaltzy, a little bit more poppy, but also there's some great heavy stuff on here too. They had a great cover of I Think We're Alone Now that's on here. What closes out side A is a song called Rock and Roll is Dead. Me and my band used to play that when I was in high school, and it's a fucking killer track. Amazing. And again, they're following up here, back to the drawing board. This became really kind of well known in the music industry because the second track on here is a song called I Want to Be Your Boyfriend, which is an amazing, amazing power pop single and sounds very, very, very close to Avril Lavigne's I Don't Like Your Girlfriend. Look up that story. There was a settlement out of court. It's kind of crazy, but interesting stuff. But to me, these are cheap records that you can find in $5 bins. They're easy to find. They're out there. But musically, it's amazing and very, very short-lived. We're talking 77 and 79, I think, here for the Rubinoos. Another lesser-known band, unless you are from the great state of Illinois, and especially around the greater Chicagoland area, is a band called Shoes. They're out of Zion, Illinois, and this is Black Vinyl Shoes. This came out in 1977, too. Great, amazing power pop record. They had some other records, too, but their stuff's a little bit hard to find. I think their first record was privately pressed and all that kind of stuff. But what we're going to see here and where we're kind of going after this next band is we're entering the late 70s now, right? We're getting more of a punk influence going on here, right? It's not coming from that sort of schmaltzy early 70s Todd Rundgren, Raspberry side, but there's going to be other influences like punk and then soon new wave and post-punk and some other stuff that as we go along. And so the point here is that we're going through here and recognizing how power pop is changing a little bit as time goes on. You've also realized we're talking heavily about the United States at this point. So started British Invasion, started with Badfinger, and now it's been so heavily U.S. bands. So obviously not the only country to do it, but at this time, this is what so much of it was. So that is Shoes out of Illinois. Now, of course, arguably the biggest power pop band ever is also coming from Illinois, and that's Cheap Trick. I mean, still going strong today. Actually, the last record that they released a few years ago I thought was amazing. But this is their debut, which definitely has kind of a harder edge to it. a little less slick, but people love it. I do too. But obviously this was sort of the band that was going to end up really defining the sound in that late 70s into the early 80s. Of course, they would blow up big time with Live at Budokan, which I think, interesting enough, it makes sense that a live record for this style of music would take off to really add that energy and that power aspect of the pop. And it's not just slick melodies and, you know, that type of stuff going on, but instead there is that power, there is that energy that's going on. Similarly too, yeah, In Color, which is amazing. You got Heaven Tonight, which is great. And then of course you have Dream Police. And they put out some solid records after this into the 80s too. But for me, this is like the five, right? The first five. Cheap Tricks are just absolutely amazing. And now we're kind of creeping into the 80s, right? And here's where it gets a little bit interesting for me, because now there's a little bit of, with the influence of punk, but of course now punk's kind of over and we're into like post-punk new wave territory now. There is this influence of new wave, which of course a lot of it is coming to from the UK and that influence. And so when we get into 80s power pop, a lot of that is that new wave sort of influence. It's different than what we heard before, but really new wavy. And I will say also, this is where we get to some of these records sold a gazillion records on the strength of one single that you all might be tired of hearing, but the rest of the records are pretty strong. And I think no more so was there a band that really defined that sort of late 70s, early 80s power pop sound than the Knack. I will say this is a great record. Of course, the big single here is My Sharona, and I still love that song. I think it's one of the best underrated guitar solos out there. I mean, he's just ripping on that. But the rest of this record is really good, and their second one is solid too. And so just because you might be tired of the single, don't sleep on this record. But there's no doubt that there is this new wave influence with this too. It's less organic than maybe what was coming before. But without question, I mean, this really defined that sound in the late 70s, early 80s, big time with the Knack. Along with that, and maybe another song that you're absolutely tired of hearing of. But again, it's a solid record. They came from a little bit of a different angle, though, and that's the Romantics. You know, of course, the big song off their debut here was What I Like About You. You know, terrible album cover. I mean, you can tell just how 80s that is. Same thing with the back there. But the rest of this record's good. It's different than the sort of Knack type stuff. This one is almost post-punky related. I mean, there's some tracks here where it almost sounds like The Clash. I mean, this is an interesting record, but again, it's a lot more than just the single that you're probably tired of hearing about. And so again, Romantics, Knack, these records sold a lot because of how strong those singles were, but they're strong records as well. And then also, we're going into, this was a record I just showed the other day, but I love this record. This was sort of, along with like the Nick Lowe's of the world, this was somebody who really defined the sound in the early 80s, and that's Marshall Crenshaw. This is from 82 or 83, I believe. This is a perfect power pop 80s record. Again, some influence coming from that new wave, but not a ton. But yeah, this is awesome. I love this record, Marshall Crenshaw. It's a cheap record. You can find it for a couple bucks. But if you want that 80s great power pop song, songwriting, everything, get this record. And, you know, it's interesting talking about the influence of new wave, because this was a band that was at a time kind of post-punky. And then they changed sound. And then they changed sound again. And they've changed sound a million times since. But to me, this is their favorite record. A lot of people are going to call this more psychedelic pop, and you're right. But I wanted to throw it in there for the sake of this video, because I think this sums up a perfect 80s power pop record, and that's Skylarking from XTC. Probably no coincidence that this was produced by Todd Rundgren, which makes total sense. Him and Partridge did not get along at all, but sometimes that makes for really great records. But this is, yeah, definitely more psychedelic pop, but definitely them coming from that sort of post-punky, new wavy sort of side earlier in their career sort of adds that power aspect to the power pop. So this is Skylarking from XTC from 1987. So let's go into the 90s. Now, the mid to late 80s was sort of the birth of what became known as alternative music. You know, obviously you have, you know, REM and Teenage Fan Club and some of the jangly type stuff that definitely played a role. And that's all important. I just don't have those records. But for me, the perfect sort of explanation or definition of power pop in the 1990s was this band that had sort of, I don't want to say became unknown. I think amongst music nerds and collectors, we know about them, but They just never had the commercial success that so many others did. But that's Jellyfish. So Jellyfish, they're approaching this now. We're talking 90, 91. And it is this combination of huge, great harmonies, incredible songwriting, but also masterful production. This is not, stripped down production like some of the other 90s stuff that was going on, whether it was like Matthew Sweet or some of the other stuff. But this is ear candy. This is massive, amazing production, perfect vocal harmonies, perfect everything, which I can understand why people don't like that. But this and then Spilt Milk, which came after it, are an absolute perfect pair of records. Those were the only two records they released, and then they broke up. However, there's some offshoots. Specifically, I wanted to show this one. This is the Licorice Quartet Threesome Volume 1. This came out a few years ago. This is about 75% of Jellyfish here. An amazing modern-day power pop here stuff as well. So absolutely, if you're near power pop, you need Jellyfish. It's just absolutely amazing. Along kind of different lines, this is a little bit more of the alternative pop sort of side of power pop. And this came out in 1994. Shout out to Sam St. John, who sent me this record and really got me into this record. And that is Velvet Crush, Teenage Symphonies to God. This is an amazing record, but definitely more the emphasis on that sort of alternative power pop side. Less production, less perfection, all that kind of stuff, and just a little bit more organic and stripped down in a way. But this is absolutely amazing from 1994. I forget if this was produced by Matthew Sweet. It might have been, but Matthew Sweet was definitely involved. And I don't have any Matthew Sweet, or I would show him for the 90s for sure. And here's the last one, and people might not like this, but it's true. This was a record that defined, I think, power pop in the 90s, and commercially was hugely successful, and still is. A lot of these songs are still radio staples, played all the time. This band has become really prolific, and again, for the time, 1994, this absolutely blew up, and it's the debut from Weezer. A lot of people might not associate Weezer with power pop, but it absolutely is. The added plus to this was that this was produced by Rick Ocasek from The Cars, right? So he's coming in with such a perfect pop sensibility and everything that he did with the band. But yeah, I mean, for 1994, we're in the heat of, grunge is sort of ish on a way out. Everything is so dark. Everything is so moody. And Weezer comes in with this sort of poppy, nerdy, geeky, alternative power pop record, which was a breath of fresh air. Absolutely love Weezer. They're a great band. And this is a perfect record from 94 that really, I think, defines the genre. Let's jump up to the early to mid 2000s, because the 90s were a lot of stuff, right? I mean, you could argue that like some boy band stuff was power pop, right? There's a lot of different stuff going on, and again, I only want to sort of highlight a few things. But to me, this was a band that I think was terribly, terribly, terribly misunderstood. Why? Because they had one huge single that was everywhere. And it's a banger. It's a great song. Not necessarily indicative of their sound, though. And I wonder if it hurt them in terms of how people viewed their music. And that band is Fountains of Wayne. This is Welcome Interstate Managers. Probably their masterpiece, whatever it might be. But this was a record that came out in 2003. Stacy's Mom was the huge hit that is on this record. That was everywhere, but this is perfect power pop. If you like power pop, whether it's early, later, Jellyfish, all that type of stuff, you will love this record and the other records that they did too. Of course, we lost Adam Schlesinger a couple of years ago due to COVID, but he, of course, was involved in a lot of different projects, including Tinted Windows, which was sort of a power poppy type supergroup. But yeah, Welcome Interstate Managers. If all you know about Fountains of Wayne is Stacy's Mom, seriously, check this out. If you're into the genre, this is absolutely incredible, outstanding. With that, I kind of want to jump all the way up to today. Of course, there was a lot that was going on between 2003 and 2024, but really I wanted to focus on a couple of bands that are around today that I really love. This first one that I'll show has actually gotten a lot of love in the vinyl community. They're a band from New York. This was their second record that they released. And to me, they're absolute power pop. They're a throwback band. To me, they're the band that really leans into the power aspect. I hear early Cheap Trick, like that first record we talked about, that's a little less polished, a little bit more raw. I'm into that type of stuff. That to me is this band. That's not to say they're sloppy. That's not to say that they're not great. That's just the sound of it. But the band's from New York and they're called the Midnight Callers. Of course, reference to the Badfinger song. And this is Rattled Humming Heart. This came out last year. And is absolutely amazing. This is a band that has not blown up, although a lot of people do know about them now. And I'm just waiting for them to jump on a tour. Like, do it, boys. Jump on a tour. Get out there, because this is incredible stuff, incredible modern day power pop. And we would just love to see you on tour to get the word out there. But if you're into Cheap Trick, if you're into even like some old school Mata Hoople, you'll love this type of stuff. It's absolutely amazing. And then last is one of my favorite bands of today that I've talked about a ton. While Midnight Callers leans a little bit more into that power aspect of the pop, this is a band that leans heavily more into the pop aspect with a little bit of backing power. To me, this is like the Raspberries, the Rubinoos, really reincarnate. And that is the Lemon Twigs. This is their record that came out last year in 2023 called Everything Harmony. It's two brothers from Long Island who are just insanely talented, great singers, great multi-instrumentalists. This is, like I said, this is Raspberries, this is Rubinoos, this is Todd Rundgren big time. This is also heavy, think Surf's Up era Beach Boys. I mean, there are some moments on here where you're like, ooh, is Brian Wilson kind of doing this type of stuff? This is incredible. So Everything Harmony, this is by the Lemon Twigs, an amazing modern day power pop band. They got a new record coming out here in about a month or so in May. So yeah, there you have it, a crash course, a primer through the decades. I think if you're looking to get into the genre, or maybe you already are, but looking for some different recommendations, those are some places to start. So I know I left out a ton. I know I don't have a ton, but would love to hear from you. What am I missing? What are some of your favorite power pop bands or albums? And yeah, I appreciate you all sticking around and being here. And we'll see you soon on the next video. So take care and cheers, everyone. Bye.